Here's something they don't tell you about investing in family. The moment you agree to fund a dream, you stop being the person who raised them. You become a liability. And liabilities apparently don't get invited to the groundbreaking. Let me tell you all about my experience. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit subscribe if you haven't yet, and stay with me. You're going to want to see how this ends. My name is Arthur Pendelton. I am 66 years old, retired after 34 years as a board-certified anesthesiologist, and I have spent most of my adult life watching people breathe. When you spend 3 decades managing the line between consciousness and oblivion, you learn a few things about human nature. You learn how to read the micro-expressions that happen when someone is lying to themselves. You learn how to spot the tremor in a hand that says the mind is already somewhere else. You learn that silence is rarely empty. It is usually full of calculation. I thought I had seen every variation of medical and financial theater this country could produce. I was wrong, and the person who proved it to me was a man in a tailored charcoal suit who called me Dr. Pendelton at a steakhouse, smiled like a man who had already balanced the ledger, and asked for $500,000 like he was ordering another bottle of wine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stay with me. It started, as most well-constructed disasters do, with a document that looked perfectly reasonable. My son-in-law Marcus came to our house on a Sunday evening in late September. Claire was in the kitchen finishing the roast chicken. I was in the study reviewing a book on the history of surgical anesthesia, though I wasn't really reading it. I was waiting. Marcus walked in carrying a leather portfolio, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly groceries, and sat across from me at the oak desk. He laid it open. The cover read, Pioneer Valley Multi-Specialty Group. Capital expansion and buy-in proposal. I looked at Marcus. He was 32, good hands, steady eyes, the kind of man who had earned his place in a residency program through sheer stubbornness and long hours. I had watched him marry my daughter. I had watched him hold her through the miscarriage in their second year. I had watched him become the father to my grandson I knew he would be. I trusted him with my family. That did not mean I trusted the portfolio. I turned the first page, clean projections, regional demographic maps, patient acquisition models, a timeline that promised profitability by month 22. I flipped to the back. There was a logo. A stylized pine tree overlapping a caduceus. Beneath it, in understated serif font, healing forward together. I closed the portfolio. I said, walk me through the structure. Marcus leaned forward. He spoke carefully, the way young professionals do when they know they're stepping into unfamiliar territory. He talked about buying a 20% equity stake in an established multi-specialty clinic. 4 primary care physicians, 2 orthopedic surgeons, a small diagnostic imaging center. The managing partner, Julian Vance, was looking for capital to expand into a second location, upgrade imaging equipment, and centralize billing and supply procurement. The buy-in required $480,000. Marcus had saved $120,000. He was asking me to cover the remainder. I said, where did you get these projections? Marcus said, Julian's team built them. They've been running similar expansions in 2 neighboring states. The model is proven. The numbers are conservative. I nodded slowly. I said, who handles the centralized billing? Marcus said, a partner firm. Centralized billing solutions. Julian says it cuts administrative overhead by 30%. They also handle medical supply procurement through MedSource Direct, vertical integration, cleaner margins. I looked at Marcus. I said, and you're comfortable with that? He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but I've spent 34 years reading fraction of a second hesitations. I said, it's fine. Julian's done this before. He's brought in family. He wants this to work for all of us. I picked up the portfolio again. I said, I'll think about it. Marcus exhaled. He didn't push. He just nodded, closed the portfolio, and stood. He said, thank you, Arthur, really. I know this isn't a small thing. I said, it isn't. Give me a week. He left. I sat in the study for a long time after he walked out the front door. The house was quiet. Claire came in carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down beside my elbow and sat on the edge of the desk. She said, you're not going to wire it. I said, no. She said, good. She didn't ask why. We've been married for 41 years. She speaks the same language I do. The one where you listen to what isn't said. The one where you notice when a man uses the word family to describe a vendor network. The one where you recognize the difference between a doctor who wants to build something and a businessman who wants to extract something. 3 days later, I called Evelyn Shaw. Evelyn and I met in 2008 when she was lead counsel for a hospital network restructuring. She's a healthcare corporate attorney who treats compliance like a religion. She answered on the second ring. I said, Evelyn, I need you to look at a clinic buy-in proposal. She said, Arthur, the last time you said that, I spent 11 days untangling a radiology group that was billing Medicare for phantom patients. Forgive me if I sigh before I say, send it over. She sighed. Then she said, send it over. I sent the portfolio. I also sent the LLC operating agreement Marcus had forwarded, the vendor contract templates, and the billing authorization forms. I told Evelyn what Julian had said, what Marcus had believed, and what Claire had noticed in the space between the words. Evelyn said, give me 10 days. I gave her 10 days. In the meantime, I played my part perfectly. I called Marcus. I told him I was in. I listened to him go quiet on the phone. That particular silence of a man who cannot believe something he wanted is actually happening. He said, Arthur, really? I said, it's a solid model, Marcus. I believe in you. What I did not say was, I believe in you completely. It's the architecture around you I'm not so sure about. Claire was standing in the hallway when I hung up. She said, you're not transferring the money yet, are you? I said, of course not. She said, good. Then she walked back to her book. 41 years, and she still trusted my instincts even when I hadn't fully explained them. That woman deserves a quiet monument. Evelyn called me on a Thursday evening. I knew from the tone in the first 3 seconds that she had found something. Evelyn is a woman who is almost always dry and almost always precise. That evening, she sounded like a woman who had just opened a ledger she didn't expect to find blood in. She said, Arthur, you're going to want to sit down. I said, I'm already sitting. She said, sit better. I pulled my chair closer to the desk. I said, talk to me. Evelyn said, that business plan your son-in-law's partner put together. Beautiful document, professional, clean projections, reasonable timelines, reasonable margins. He paused, completely disconnected from the actual financial structure filed with the state medical board and the IRS. The room got very still. I said, say that again. Evelyn said, the business plan Marcus was given is a showpiece. What they actually registered, the LLC structure, the vendor contracts, the billing routing, it tells a completely different story. Centralized Billing Solutions and MedSource Direct aren't independent partner firms. They're both wholly owned subsidiaries of a holding company called Vance Strategic Health Group. The holding company is owned by Julian Vance's brother-in-law, Richard Thorne. I sat back in my chair. I closed my eyes. I thought about Julian at the steakhouse, smiling, talking about vertical integration and cleaner margins. I said, how long has this been running? Evelyn said, long enough to establish a pattern. I pulled records from 2 other multi-specialty buy-ins in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Same structure, same vendor routing, same managing partner. Arthur, the capital isn't going into clinic expansion. It's being routed through inflated supply contracts and up-coded billing services. The operational accounts are being drained at a rate of 18 to 22% above fair market value. The plan appears to be to run the clinics long enough to justify the investment, manufacture a reimbursement shortfall or managed care dispute, force a distress valuation, and buy out the minority partners at a fraction of the initial buy-in price. I said, distress sale. Evelyn said, exactly. Clean exit, minimal paper trail. The holding company retains the vendor contracts, the billing infrastructure, and the real estate leases. The minority partners take the loss. Julian keeps the network. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. The house was quiet. Claire was upstairs reading. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked the way it always does, patient, indifferent, keeping time whether you want it to or not. I thought about Marcus. I thought about the way his voice had softened when he thanked me. I thought about the portfolio, the logo, the word family used like a scalpel. And then I picked up the phone and called Dr. Aris Thorne. Not Richard Thorne, Aris, a different man entirely. Aris and I served on a state medical board audit committee together in the 90s. He is a former CMS compliance investigator who now runs a private healthcare auditing firm. He answers the phone like a man who expects every conversation to be a deposition. He said, Arthur, it's been a while. I said, Aris, I need you to look at a clinic's vendor and billing architecture. I need you to tell me exactly how the money moves when the capital clears. A pause. Then Aris said, you want me to map the plumbing? I said, I want you to find the leaks. He said, send the contracts, the LLC filings. The vendor agreements, the billing authorization templates, give me 2 weeks. I sent him everything. I hung up. I looked at the clock. I smiled, not because anything was funny, but because the game had changed and only one of us knew it yet. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Let me tell you something about being deliberately excluded. It is not the exclusion itself that hurts. It is the performance that surrounds it. The careful construction of reasons, the cheerful tone of voice. The way people look at you like you're supposed to smile and accept it and ask no questions. I have never been good at that last part. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Claire came to find me in my study. I was reading or pretending to. Mostly I was thinking about Evelyn's phone call and the name Vance Strategic Health Group, and the way a person could build a trap with projection spreadsheets and vendor contracts and a logo with a pine tree on it. Claire stood in the doorway and said, "Julian called Marcus." I looked up, I said, "And?" She said, "The expansion broke ground 10 days ago." I put my book down very slowly. I said, "When?" Claire said, 10 days ago. The room was quiet. I let that number sit in the air between us. 10 days, not a phone call, not a text message, not even a photograph sent casually the way people do when they want to seem like they remembered you as an afterthought. "Nothing," I said. "What exactly did he say?" Claire sat down across from me. She folded her hands in her lap the way she does when she is controlling something. Anger, I suspected, though with Claire it always comes out looking like composure. She said, "He said," and I'm quoting directly here, so don't look at me like that. "He said it was 10 days ago. We only invited core partners and key stakeholders. It was very internal, very low-key." I looked at my wife. My wife looked at me. I said, "Core partners and key stakeholders." Claire said, "That's what he said." I said, "We are his investors. We are Marcus's family." Claire said, "I'm aware of that, Arthur." I leaned back in my chair. I thought about the word internal. I thought about $480,000. I thought about how internal is a very interesting word to use when you're describing an event that was funded almost entirely by someone you chose not to invite. Then I smiled. Claire watched me smile and said, "Why are you smiling? I need you to explain the smile because from where I'm sitting, there is nothing remotely amusing about any of this." I said, "I'm smiling because he called Marcus." Claire said, "He called Marcus to tell us we weren't invited." I said, "No. He called Marcus to check on us. There's a difference." Claire stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Evelyn," I said, "everything is exactly where it needs to be." She nodded once, stood up, smoothed her cardigan, and walked back out of the room like a woman who had decided to trust her husband one more time and was reserving the right to say "I told you so" if it went sideways. 3 days passed. I went about my life with the particular calmness of a man who is waiting for something he is already prepared for. I had breakfast. I read the medical journals I hadn't touched since retirement. I called Aris twice to confirm the details he had sent me. Both times he answered with the enthusiasm of a man who was genuinely enjoying himself, which for Aris meant he said things like, "This gets more interesting every day," in the same tone most people use to discuss arterial blood gas results. On the third day, my phone rang. I looked at the screen, Julian Vance. I let it ring twice, not because I wasn't ready, but because I believe in the power of making people wait exactly long enough to feel it. Then I answered. I said, "Julian, what a nice surprise." His voice came through warm and slightly breathless, the way it always was when he was performing urgency without wanting to seem panicked. He said, "Dr. Pendelton, hi, I'm so glad you picked up." "How are you? How's Claire?" I said, "We're wonderful, just enjoying the week, quiet around here." He laughed, that light, practiced laugh. He said, "That sounds so nice. Listen, I don't want to take up too much of your time." I said, "You're not. Take all the time you need." A tiny pause, then he continued. "So, we've been getting the expansion fully operational, and you know how it is with new medical ventures. The first few weeks are just, there's so much coming at you at once. Equipment installation, credentialing, supply chain integration, staffing." I said, "Sounds demanding." He said, "It really is. It really truly is. Marcus is handling the clinical onboarding beautifully. It's wonderful to watch." Another small pause, shorter this time. "So, the thing is, Arthur, some of the initial capital draws are coming due. Operational setup costs, some equipment balances, just the natural cash flow of a new launch. And we were expecting the buy-in transfer to have cleared by now, and I just wanted to touch base and make sure everything was still on track on your end." Silence. I let it stretch. 1 second, 2, 3. He said, "Arthur." I said, "I'm here." He said, with just the faintest tremor of impatience underneath the warmth, "Did you get a chance to transfer the funds?" And I smiled. Not the polite smile I use at dinner parties. Not the professional smile from 34 years of closing surgical schedules and negotiating or block time. The real one. The one Claire says makes me look like I know something the rest of the room doesn't. I said, "Of course, it was handled weeks ago." Now, you need to understand what happened in the silence that followed that sentence, because that silence told me everything I needed to know and confirmed everything Evelyn and Aris had already found. If Julian was who he presented himself to be, a devoted managing partner, a diligent expansion architect, a professional who simply forgot to invite his investors to a groundbreaking, that silence would have lasted half a second. He would have exhaled and said something like, "Oh, wonderful, it must just be a processing delay. I'll check with our banking liaison." Instead, the silence lasted 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is a long time on a phone call. I counted, then he said very carefully, "Handled how?" I said, "Transferred as agreed, every dollar." He said, "To the account." I said, "To the account that was set up for this purpose." Yes, another pause, shorter this time, but tighter. I could almost hear him recalculating behind it. He said, which account specifically? Because I want to make sure our finance director is looking in the right place. I said, Evelyn Shaw has all the details. She handled the compliance structure on my behalf. You remember Evelyn. I mentioned her when we discussed the professional corporation formation. Give her a call. She's been expecting to hear from someone. The temperature of the conversation changed. I cannot explain it more precisely than that. Something shifted, the way air shifts before a storm. And for just one moment, just one unguarded moment, Julian stopped performing. He said, "Who is Evelyn Shaw?" And there it was. Because if you were a legitimate managing partner overseeing a legitimate clinic expansion funded by your investor's legitimate capital, and your investor told you his attorney handled the transfer, you would say, "Great. I'll call her right away. What's her direct line?" You would not say, "Who is Evelyn Shaw?" In a voice that had gone 2 degrees colder than it was 60 seconds ago. I said very pleasantly, "She's my healthcare counsel. Has been for 22 years, wonderful woman, speaks slowly but thorough. You'll like her." He recovered quickly. I will give him that. He said, "Of course, yes, I'll reach out to her." "Do you have a number for her?" I said. "Tell her Arthur sent you. She'll take good care of you." We said our goodbyes with all the warmth of a business transaction disguised as a collegial conversation. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen where Claire was making coffee, and I said, "He called." Claire said, without turning around, "I know." "I could tell by your walk," I said. "He's going to call Evelyn within the hour." Claire poured 2 cups and handed me one. She said, "And what is Evelyn going to tell him?" I said, "Exactly what I told her to." Claire wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "And Marcus?" "When does Marcus find out?" I looked out the kitchen window at the yard. The maple tree we planted the year our daughter was born was thick and solid now, roots deep, branches wide. I had watched that tree for 32 years. I said soon, but not from Julian, and not before we know exactly how deep this goes. Claire was quiet for a moment, then she said very softly, "He's going to be devastated." I said, "I know that too." We stood there in the kitchen, coffee warm in our hands, the maple tree standing in the yard, and neither of us said what we were both thinking. That some discoveries cannot be unfound, and some loyalties, once tested, reveal exactly what they were made of all along. My phone buzzed an hour and 14 minutes later. It was Evelyn. I answered and said, "That was fast." Evelyn, in her precise and deliberate way, said, "He called, asked about the account. I told him the funds had been secured in escrow pending verification of the operational and compliance structure." I said, "How did he take that?" Evelyn paused in that way of hers, like she's choosing each word from a very specific shelf. Then she said, "He asked what verification meant. I told him it meant we needed to confirm that the registered vendor contracts, billing, routing, and supply procurement match the investment agreement and comply with state medical board and CMS anti-kickback guidelines." He asked how long that would take. Another pause. I told him it depended entirely on how cooperative the documentation process was. I said, "And," Evelyn said. He hung up before I finished the sentence. I set my coffee down on the counter. I said, "Evelyn, it's time to make the call to Eris." Evelyn said, "Already ahead of you. He sent the vendor audit and billing routing analysis an hour ago." A long pause. Then slowly, like a woman savoring the weight of what she's about to say, Evelyn added, "Arthur, there's something else." I said, "Tell me." Evelyn said, "What about him?" Evelyn said, "Julian isn't just running a side network. He filed paperwork in 3 other states, 3 other clinic expansions, 3 other minority investors. Eris cross-referenced the vendor IDs, the billing authorization codes, and the holding company LLCs. The pattern is identical. Arthur, this isn't the first time, it's a franchise." The kitchen was very quiet. I said, "This isn't a clinic, it's a harvesting operation." Evelyn said, "No, Arthur. It is not." I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that call. The maple tree, the yard, 32 years of watching something grow. And somewhere across town, in a clinic with a pine tree and a caduceus above the door, a man was making phone calls he thought I didn't know about to a woman I now knew more about than he realized. The smile came back, the real one, because the thing about being an investor instead of a father-in-law, sometimes being the investor is exactly the right position to be in. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you, for real. There's a particular kind of morning that exists only in the weeks before something enormous happens. The sky looks the same. The coffee tastes the same. The birds outside do whatever birds do, completely indifferent to the fact that somewhere nearby a carefully constructed lie is about to meet the person who built the trap it walked into. I have always loved those mornings. It was a Friday. Claire was at the table when I came downstairs. She had her reading glasses on and her coffee in front of her, and she looked up at me the way she has looked up at me for 41 years, like she already knows what I'm about to say and is simply waiting for me to say it. I said, "Today." She took her glasses off, set them on the table, said, "Marcus too." I said, "Marcus first." She nodded, stood up, refilled her coffee, and said with the quiet devastation of a mother who loves her son-in-law completely, "Make sure he hears it from you gently, Arthur. Whatever Julian did, Marcus still trusts him. That part is real, even if nothing else was." I looked at my wife and thought, not for the first time, that the smartest decision I ever made in my life was asking her to marry me in a hospital parking lot in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1982, with $40 in my wallet and nothing to offer but my word. I said, "I'll be gentle." She said, "You're going to want to be, because the moment he finds out, the gentle part becomes your job and the fury becomes his, and you need him clear-headed for what comes next." I called Marcus at 9 in the morning. He answered on the first ring, the way young physicians answer when they're busy and distracted and running on the energy of something new. He said, "Arthur, hey, good timing actually. We just got the new MRI suite fully calibrated. You should come see it sometime, it's incredible." I said, "Marcus, I need you to come over." Something in my voice stopped him. I know this because the background noise of the clinic, the paging system, the movement, the low hum of machinery, all of it went quiet like he had stepped into a separate room. He said, "Is everything okay, Claire?" I said, "Claire is fine, everyone is fine, but I need you to come over and I need you to come alone." A pause, then carefully, "How alone?" I said, "Don't tell Julian you're coming." The silence that followed was the longest one we had shared since the day I told him about the miscarriage. I could feel him on the other end of the line, turning that sentence over, looking at it from different angles, not wanting to understand what it might mean. He said, "Arthur, what's going on?" I said, "Come over, son. I'll explain everything." He arrived 40 minutes later. He came through the front door and into the kitchen, and he looked exactly like what he was, a 32-year-old man who had driven across town with a knot in his stomach that he didn't have a name for yet. Claire hugged him first, held on a beat longer than usual. Marcus let her, which told me the knot had already started to tighten. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had laid out his portfolio and his projections and his logo 3 months ago. I sat across from him. Claire stayed nearby but gave us the room. I did not ease into it. In my experience, easing into devastating news only prolongs the part where the person is confused and shortens the part where they can actually think. So I laid the folder on the table, Evelyn's folder, clean, organized, numbered. I said, "Before I transferred a single dollar of that buy-in, I had someone look at everything." Marcus looked at the folder. He did not touch it. He said, "What kind of someone?" I said, "Evelyn Shaw, you've met her, healthcare corporate counsel. Dr. Eris Thorne, former CMS compliance investigator, healthcare auditor." Marcus's jaw moved slightly. He said, "You had the clinic audited." I said, "I had the architecture audited." He looked up at me and I watched something move across his face. Not anger, not yet, something more complicated. The particular expression of a person who is starting to understand that 2 conversations have been happening simultaneously and they were only present in one of them. He said quietly, "What did they find?" I opened the folder and I walked him through it. Every page, the holding company, the routing of capital through inflated vendor contracts. The discrepancy between the business plan Julian had presented to Marcus and the actual legal and financial structure he had filed independently. The 3 other states, the 3 other investors, the pattern that was older than their partnership and more deliberate than anything Marcus had been willing to consider. I spoke slowly. I did not editorialize. I let the documents do what documents do, which is tell the truth without emotion, which is sometimes the only way truth can be heard. When I finished, Marcus sat very still. He did not cry. He did not shout. He stared at the folder for a long moment, and then he said in a voice that was almost too controlled, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough to protect the capital, not long enough to protect you from this conversation." "I'm sorry about that," he said, "the buy-in, the 480. I said, "In escrow, a neutral trust company, every dollar, it never went anywhere Julian could reach it." Something crossed his face then. Relief and grief arriving at the same moment, which is one of the cruelest combinations a person can experience. He put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. Then he said, "He told me you'd transferred it, weeks ago." He showed me a wire confirmation. I said, "I know." He said, "He fabricated a transfer confirmation." I said, "Eris believes so. Evelyn is working with that assumption." Marcus pushed back from the table slowly, stood up, walked to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to me, looking at the yard, the maple tree. I let him have that. After a long moment he said, without turning around, "Vance Strategic Health Group." I said, "His brother-in-law's holding company." He said, "I've met him twice. He came to the clinic last month to review the imaging contracts. I thought he was just." He stopped. I watched his shoulders rise and fall. I introduced myself, showed him the new suite. He shook my hand. The room was very quiet. Then Marcus said, still at the window, "Was any of it real, Arthur? Did he ever—" He stopped again, started over. Was the clinic real at least, or was that just the mechanism? And that was the question I had been dreading, because the answer was complicated in the way that only true things can be complicated. I said, "The clinic is real, the building is leased, the equipment exists, the credentials are valid. What wasn't real was where the money was going after it arrived." The plan was to run the clinic long enough to justify the buy-in, extract as much as possible through the inflated vendor and billing contracts, and then, Eris believes, manufacture a managed care reimbursement dispute, force a financial shortfall, trigger a distress valuation, and buy out the minority partners at a fraction of the initial capital. Julian keeps the vendor network, the holding company keeps the infrastructure, you take the loss. Marcus turned around. His eyes were dry, but his face looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 40 minutes. He said, "And then what? They just disappear." I said, "There's a property. Evelyn found it, commercial real estate in a neighboring county, listed under a holding company that connects back to Vance Strategic. It's already prepped for a second imaging center. The capital from your buy-in was supposed to fund it." Marcus stared at me. He said he was going to take my father-in-law's money and buy his own real estate. I said, "That appears to be the intention, yes." Like a man whose legs have decided they've had enough, he put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he stayed like that for a while. I did not fill the silence. Some silences are not meant to be filled. Claire appeared in the doorway. She looked at me. I gave her the smallest nod. She came to the table and sat beside Marcus and put her hand on his back and said nothing. Just that, her hand on his back. After a while, Marcus lifted his head. His eyes were red now, but his voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. He said, "What happens next?" What happened next took 11 days. Evelyn filed the compliance documentation with the state medical board. Eris's audit went to 2 healthcare fraud investigators who had, it turned out, been building a separate case on Julian Vance for 14 months and were very interested in what we had. Julian received a formal notice from Evelyn's office on a Tuesday morning. I was told he called Evelyn 4 times that day. Evelyn, being Evelyn, returned none of those calls until she was ready. And when she was ready, she spoke slowly and thoroughly and left no room for misunderstanding. Richard Thorne, Julian's brother-in-law and the nominal owner of the holding company, was questioned by state regulators on a Thursday. Julian retained a healthcare defense attorney by Friday afternoon, and on Saturday morning my phone rang. "Julian." I looked at the screen for a moment, then I answered. He said, "Arthur." His voice was different. The warmth was gone. The performance was gone. What remained was something raw, and I thought more honest than anything he had offered me in 2 years of steakhouse dinners and tailored suits and carefully angled smiles. He said, "You knew from the beginning." I said, "Not from the beginning, but early enough." A long pause. Then he said, "The escrow account." Another pause. "You were never going to just wire the money." I said, "No." He said, "Why didn't you just say something? Confront us." And I thought about that. I thought about Marcus at the kitchen window, the maple tree, Claire's hand on his back. I thought about 3 other investors in 3 other states who presumably had not had an Evelyn Shaw or an Eris Thorne and had not had a wife who noticed a half-second smile at a portfolio presentation. I said, "Because saying something would have protected my capital. What I did protects the people who come after you." Silence, long and complete. Then he said very quietly, "He didn't know Arthur." "Marcus didn't know any of it." I said, "I know that." I said, "He's family. I know exactly what he is." He had nothing after that. We said nothing more. The call ended. Marcus filed for partnership dissolution 8 weeks later. It was not easy. None of it was easy. He came to dinner on Thursday nights, and sometimes he talked, and sometimes he just sat with us and ate, and let the house be what it had always been. A place where nothing was required of him except to show up. The clinic, as it turned out, was viable, genuinely viable. Stripped of the financial architecture Julian had built around it and restructured with Evelyn's guidance and Eris's oversight, it had good bones. Good location, good clinical staff. The physicians who had stayed were good doctors. They just needed clean books. On a Tuesday in November, on a morning when the sky was doing that particular autumn thing where everything looks cleaner than it has any right to, Marcus called me. He said, "Arthur, I want to show you something." I drove across town. I parked in front of a building with a sign above the door. The sign said Pioneer Valley Medical Group, clean font, no pine tree, no caduceus. Just the name of the place and the work that happened inside it. Marcus was standing outside waiting for me. He looked like himself again, not the version from the kitchen table, the earlier version. The one with the portfolio and the projections and the steady hands. He said, "I know it's not how we planned it. I know a lot happened," but he stopped, looked up at the sign. "It's still real." It was always going to be real. I stood beside my son-in-law on the sidewalk and looked at our name above the door. I said, "Show me the MRI suite." He laughed, first real laugh I'd heard from him in months. He said, "It's incredible, Arthur, I told you." I said, "You did." He held the door open and I walked in. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old paper and something new, the kind of new that has been earned. I looked around the waiting room, the clean sightlines, the front desk, the light coming through the windows, and I thought about 3 months of patience. About a healthcare attorney who treats compliance like a religion. About a former CMS investigator who maps plumbing for a living. About a woman who noticed a half-second smile at a kitchen table and trusted her instincts enough to say something. And I thought about the fact that I almost signed that check on a Sunday evening without a second thought, because it had my son-in-law's hope in his eyes and a logo that looked professional, and sometimes love makes you want to skip the part where you pay attention. Almost I sat down on a bench in the waiting area. Marcus poured 2 cups of water from the cooler and set one in front of me. He raised his, he said, to the clinic. I picked up my cup. I looked at Marcus. I looked at the room. I said to pay attention. We drank, and outside through the window, the November light did what November light always does. It made everything look like it had already survived something, because it had. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of the sphere.